Good morning and good Shabbos, and welcome back once again, Valley Beth Shalom, live and online. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and I'm joined this morning by my friends and colleagues and teachers, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University, and Rabbi Marc Gellman of the Jesse James Gang. So we're delighted to have all of you with us this morning for Torah study, and we're delighted to welcome you to this Memorial Day weekend. Just as a reminder, this morning following our Torah study, there's Shabbos morning prayers at 10 o'clock. And at 11:30 this morning, we're going to continue our wonderful tradition of honoring veterans, both living and gone, at a very special ceremony at 11:30. So please stay tuned and join us as well this afternoon following the Memorial Day Veterans Celebration. Our friend Rabbi Hillel Silverman will share a few thoughts about this week's Torah portion. So Marc, Sherre, welcome. It's good to have you here. This morning we're beginning a new book of the Torah, the book of Numbers, which is a book I happen to have a sort of perverse love and affection for, because I think that in many ways it is a message to my generation. I was raised in this 60s generation. I have long hair again, so it's the first time since the 60s. And my generation was made up of people who had beautiful utopian visions of how they wanted to change the world. And what we saw, what came of those visions, was when those visions met the real world, when those visions met the structures of power and the routines of everyday life, so many of the people of my generation became terribly disillusioned, because they discovered that to change the world takes a lot more than raising your fist in the air and screaming power to the people, or out of Vietnam, or any of the slogans that we were so enamored of, or singing the songs that became so much the anthem of our generation. The realism of the world came crashing down. And I think the book of Numbers takes that problem up. The book of Numbers, I think, speaks in the language, speaks in the voice of an elder statesman, of an elder moral teacher, who says to the young, I respect and I cherish your idealism. I cherish your energy. I cherish your vision. I think the book of Numbers cherishes the vision that we spoke about last week of Ahar B'chukotai, the priestly vision of a utopian economy. The book of Numbers speaks in the voice of an elder statesman who says, I cherish all of that, but I don't want you becoming disillusioned. So before you leave the cocoon of the family and go out into the world and try to change the world, let me take you on a tour of the dark side of the human soul. The book is called Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness, because the first line of the book says that this is what happened in the wilderness of Sinai. But Bamidbar is exactly the right name of this book, because it tells us about the wilderness of the human soul. In chapter 11 of this book, we're going to leave Mount Sinai and begin the journey toward the promised land. And the very first thing that happens, is we have a reiteration of the stories that we met in Exodus about the people fetching to Moshe. There isn't enough water. The food is dull and boring. We want to eat meat. And they say to Moses, one of the most classic lines, they say, we remember the food, the vegetables, the fruits, the dainties that we ate in Egypt. And the Hebrew is chinam, for free. They forget the oppression of genocide, the oppression of slavery. All they can remember nostalgically is that world that they came from. Now, we know these things because we heard them in Exodus. So if you have an event, and then you have an interruption, and you have that event recur, what that means is the interruption didn't change anything. And what was the interruption? It was the revelation at Mount Sinai. We met God at Mount Sinai, and God gave us truth. But now that we're back on the road, the first thing we're thinking about is our bellies. Moshe gave us truth. Moses gave us faith. Moses gave us a vision of the society, the sacred society we could be, but all the people could think about is their bellies. And then we arrive at the boundaries of Eretz Canaan, just 2 years after we left Egypt. And he sends spies into the land, and when they come back, the people are too afraid to move forward. We meet fear. And when the people are cursed with 40 years of wandering in the desert, Korach rebels against Moshe. His first cousin rebels against him. And we meet jealousy. And then we meet the rebellion of Miriam and Aaron against Moses. And we meet interfamily conflict. And one step after another, it is a tour of the dark side of the human soul, as if the elder statesman says to the young idealist, I love and cherish your idealism, but you have to understand the human material out of which you wish to create your utopia. And unless you truly understand who these people are and what drives them and the darker sides of their character, you're going to find yourself disillusioned and angry and bitter. And that's what I want to keep you from. That's what I want to prevent you. The book of Bamidbar is an inoculation against the bitterness of a disillusioned idealist. And at the very end of the book, we somehow come together. And what happens is, at the very end of the book, we arrive at the boundaries of Eretz Canaan. We actually arrive at the promised land. But there's one more thing that has to be done, and that's going to come in Deuteronomy, which are the words that Moses is going to speak to us. The book of Numbers is a book full of noise. Everyone's screaming at everyone else. Everyone is at each other's throats. And everyone gangs up on Moses. First, the people rebel against him, and then his tribe rebels against him, and then his family rebels against him, and then even God betrays him. And at the end, you have Rahmanas on Moses, except for one thing. He keeps pushing forward. He keeps pushing forward. He is the symbol of the chastened idealist who says, nevertheless, I'm going to pursue this dream. And that's why I love him at the end of the book. Sherre, what do you think about revolution and working together as a community?
First of all, thank you again for having me, Rabbi Feinstein. Nice to see you, Rabbi Gellman. I was so struck by your description of the Bamidbar being a noisy book. It feels like a synagogue committee meeting gone bad, right? I have this idea. I have this idea. That's not a good idea. You've got to think about humans. Why? This is my way of doing it. This is my way of doing it. And I feel like every time you're dealing with humans, you're dealing with so many things that are unspoken in the room. And I think Bamidbar is a testament to not only Moses' resilience to handle that and a motto of leadership, but that the human condition has not changed that much. We can have all these lofty, great ideas, but we got to work together to enact them. And that's the harder part. It's not the ideas, it's the actual collaboration. And I think the Bamidbar is both a cautionary tale and it's a message of hope. I love your read of it. Love. We can't hear you.
I know. Sorry. Rabbi Gellman.
Yes, that would be me.
Can we change the world? Should we try to change the world?
You know the Wiesel quote, I did it not so that I would change them, but so that they wouldn't change me. The change in the world, and that I think is really one of the great legacies of the 60s, is that you must be the change you want to see in the world. You must be that change. This idea of externalizing change is untrue, it's unfair. But I also want to join with Sherre in complimenting you on your amazing summation of the most boring book in the Torah. Not only did you find something good in it, you found something transcendent. It was a beautiful, beautiful rant, and I loved what you said. And I agree with what you say. I would like to just put a point on it, which is, what is the nature of this conflict that you identified, all right? Is it the conflict between the real world and idealism? Or I would suggest it's a different conflict that amounts to the same yelling and screaming, but it's not about the real world versus unobtainable ideals. Because I certainly don't see the priesthood or any of the representatives of the priesthood in the book as idealists. And I don't even see Moses as an idealist, nor do you. You see him as a sort of a realist, a compromising realist. No, the conflict that I see is the conflict between individualism and communalism. That's the conflict. The complaints, if you look at the complaints of Korach for example, just one of them, are not all, isn't it true, he says, that all the community of Israel is holy, each one is holy, each one. And the truth of the Torah is that, no, each one is not holy. It's the community as a whole that's holy. And he lost this sense of communalism. He lost it. And the communalism has, in numbers, the most beautiful, if somewhat boring, metaphor. And that is the march of the people around the Mishkan. It's a visual metaphor. Most metaphors are verbal, but this is a visual one. Here you have in the middle of the community, the Mishkan, God's words, God's presence. Surrounding that, like a spiritual Tootsie Pop, is the Tootsie, and that is the priesthood. You've got the Kohanim on the east side, the Kahatim on the south, Gershon on the west, and Merari on the north. Then surrounding that ring, which surrounds the Mishkan, are the tribes. You've got Judah on the east, Reuben on the south, Ephraim, I think, on the west, and Dan on the north. And so this is a visual metaphor that there is something that we are a part of that's bigger than us individually. And that, I think, ties in with the holiday that we're celebrating as secular Americans, and that's Memorial Day. That we are celebrating the triumph of communalism on the part of generations of soldiers, some of them like my father, part of the greatest generation, who during World War II became incredible heroes. And all of it was built, that it was all built on this idea that there is something bigger than ourselves, something more important than my own personal ambitions. And that, I would say, is what brought the 60s down. And I lived through it absolutely as you did, even more so perhaps because I'm older than you. But it was all about me. The 60s was about personal liberation. There wasn't a real sense of communalism. And I'm not sure that there is now, even in most of the so-called progressive social movements. And that, I think, is the contribution, and I'll close with this, of conservatism, which is this return to the notion that the way the individual finds himself or herself at our best levels, at our highest aspirations, is when we are linked to something bigger than ourselves. That is the essence of conservatism, and its enemy, its bête noire in the history of our planet and our culture, is cascading narcissistic individualism, in which my life, my interests, my rights, my career, my world trump all of you and everything beyond me. That is where Judaism becomes communal in its highest levels.
Well, I think that the
Do I get a hallelujah? Come on, you got a hallelujah.
That was brilliant. That was brilliant. I think that, see, I don't think we disagree. I think that you have this image. You have this image in the end of the book of Exodus of the people coming together at Mount Sinai. That's a visual image as well. And the statement of Naseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear, we will obey. The sense of the formation into a community. And then you have the whole book of Leviticus, which is a book about community. It's a book about collective worship, collective atonement, collective holiness, collective economic life. You have a vision there. And then the vision breaks apart. And the question is, why does the vision break apart? Why isn't the story given at Sinai, the narrative of Sinai, sufficiently powerful to weld this people into a unit? Is it something in them, in something in the story? Is it something in Moses' leadership? Because you're right. I think you're exactly right, by the way, that one of the features of the book of Bamidbar is the sense in which there's no common language. It's a book of shouting and screaming because no one can talk to each other, because no one can listen, because there's leadership but no followers. There's nobody who's willing to go along to join. Korach's rebellion isn't one rebellion; it's actually three. It's a rebellion of Korach. It's a rebellion of the Levites. It's a rebellion of 250 elders against Moses. Right? You have the apostasy of Pinchas in the age of Pinchas, and Pinchas's answer to it is to skewer these people. You have a sense of zealotry that comes back. One after the other, you have the cracking apart of this collective, and no language, no direction, no common purpose, no shared values. It's the disintegration of human community. That's the picture that the book of Bamidbar gives us. Now, you would be right by not boring, but it's a sad book in some ways, except for one thing. The reason it's not a sad book is because you turn the page, and we'll do this in a few weeks, and you come to Devarim. The Hebrew word Devarim means words. And here Moses starts speaking and people start listening. Moses leads and they follow. He teaches, they learn. And the principal word of the book of Devarim is Shema Yisrael. Listen. And there's listening in that book. It's the book of Devarim is the assurance that we can build human community, but only after we have traversed the wilderness of the human soul, the Bamidbar, the wilderness. Only once we get past the fear and the selfishness and the zealotry and the magical thinking and the desires, the individual desires, once we get past that, it is possible, says Devarim, to build human community. It's not easy, but it's possible. And that's the assurance of the book of Devarim. That's why the Torah ends with Devarim and doesn't end with Bamidbar. It could end with Bamidbar because we're at the promised land. We've achieved the goal, but we're exhausted. Please.
Eddie, I love the meta lesson that you're saying. We have our birth story, we have our journey story, then we have our utopian story, Leviticus, then we have the mess of reality, right? Which is Bamidbar. It's us in the wilderness trying to make sense of this all. And you would think that's where the book ends because we're in the promised land. But then you have the book of Devarim, which is the book of words and listening. And that the real trajectory is that to achieve the utopia is a peak experience, but to live in the world takes the talking and the listening, is the Devarim, the last messaging. It's just a beautiful paradigm for our life. And I also think it's interesting for this moment about everyone. Are we in the middle of a wilderness right now that we're trying to figure out? And is it taking the kind of listening and talking that Devarim is demanding of us? Because we don't know what the goalposts are. We don't know what the leadership is saying. We don't even understand who's the right leaders. So is this one of those moments? I think is interesting to think about.
It's certainly a moment that Marc spoke of individualism versus communitarianism. I mean, the idea that you shut down a society, force everybody to distance and wear masks because of the threat of the virus, and then the rebellion that comes back from it where people say enough is enough. You know, you hear that language in that same conversation. And it's a very bitter conversation. In some ways, a very bitter conversation. Because each side says this is what you need to do to save your life.
But it's comforting to know that this is humanity. This is how we are. This is way back in the Bible times. And they reported it because they recognized how much we were going to need it in the future.
Right. Well, the other thing that's important, I think, is that the book, as you put it so nicely, Sherre, it's important to have those ideals. I mean, I worry about kids who are too realistic. You're not supposed to be realistic when you're 18. You're not supposed to be realistic when you're 20. You're supposed to be a crazy-eyed idealist, right? That's why we send kids off to college. Because what is a college after all? It's a small island of Soviet communism in the vast American Enterprise Institute, right? You know, institution. It's this small place where crazy ideas are allowed to crazy ideas are allowed to flourish. Because that's what young people are for. That goes along with the hormones of youth. You know, and I worry about kids who get too realistic too soon. And they don't get the idealism that I think motivates. That's supposed to motivate. It's supposed to drive us to seek something better. Bamidbar is worried about the problem of realism. I'm worried about the loss of idealism in the culture. I'd like to hear idealism. I'm waiting for kids to rise up. I was very encouraged by, say, for the climate movement. Whether their solutions are realistic or not, the fact that they're moved by that commitment means something tremendous to me. And I think it's a remarkable sensibility. Now, it gets stuck in the politics of the day, and it gets stuck in social media, and that becomes very complicated. But so I find this book really comforting, especially on hot, nasty, sticky summer days when I'm stuck on the freeway. I mean, that's Bamidbar. Now you're living in the midbar. Now you're living in the midbar. The question, though, is how do you maintain some idealism if you're facing this realism? What do you hold on to drive you forward? What does Moses hold on to? So let's focus for a moment on the character of Moses. And Marc, I want to ask you a question because you've been a religious leader for your entire career and a very distinguished and important one. What keeps him from
getting beloved? You forgot that.
Yes, that's true, and humble. What keeps you from giving up? What keeps him from giving up? What drives Moshe Rabbeinu? What keeps you from giving up?
Well, what keeps me from giving up is I never did this as a job. I never thought that being a rabbi was a job. I always, and this was from the 60s, I wanted to just do something noble. That's all I wanted to do, something noble. And then I discovered a very important lesson that I learned from my 7 years of being a Hillel director at Northwestern University. And that was, I was in an institution, basically the campus Jewish group, Hillel. I was in an institution that could not succeed. Structurally, it had no chance of succeeding. And the reason was no one came to Northwestern or Brown or Harvard or anywhere to become part of the Hillel. No one did that. They came to be a part of the university. So I had to try and sell them on the idea that now that they were free of their parents' constraints, they needed Judaism. And basically I failed. I tried my best and I succeeded with some people. Eight kids decided to be rabbis, and I'm very proud of that. But I failed because structurally they weren't there for me. They were there for another agenda. And rather than become embittered from this, I realized my job was not to win. And I think Moses completely got this. His job was not to succeed, and that's why he didn't enter the land. Yes, God told him he couldn't, but I think ultimately he knew he couldn't enter the land because that would have been complete success. And what I learned, and I think Moses had in his heart, is that our job is to just wake up and do God's work that day and not worry about not keep score, not worry about how it all ends up affecting the world. That's what keeps me going. And that's what kept me going during difficult days when I couldn't succeed because I was too liberal for the Orthodox Jews at Northwestern. I was too conservative for some of the liberal Jews. There was always something that they didn't like. And they weren't members. I had to convince them to be members. So I learned that my job was to just teach Torah every day and do the best you could. I think Moses got that. I think the other thing is that Moses and God were in the same boat. And that accounts for some of the problems that you saw and described so brilliantly in the book. And that is, Moses and God are the only ones who never understood slavery on a personal level. Moses was the only Jew in Egypt. One. There was one. You say, why did God pick Moses? Well, hello. There's one Jew in Egypt who was never a slave. How about picking him? And that's exactly who God does pick. The one Jew in Egypt who was never a slave. And God was never a slave, obviously. So both of them are trying to figure out how do you emancipate slaves. And they both have this initial idea, which you described as idealism, which is, look, tell them the truth. Just tell them God sent you to be free, to leave Egypt and go to the mountain and worship God. They don't believe that. They can't believe that because they're slaves. And so I believe part of the failure of the Torah, and I know you both feel that it ends on a very high note, and I do agree with that. But the problem is the Tanakh does not end on a very high note. The entire Hebrew Bible ends on a very, very bad note, which is that we're exiled from our land, we're kicked out of the land, everything is bad, the diaspora has begun, and everyone has turned our back on us, including God. And that's how it ends. It's a tragedy. The Torah is a little bit more positive because we're entering the land, and then in Joshua and Judges and Kings, we conquer the land. So it has a little bit of an upbeat, but that's not the end of the arc of the story. So what keeps me going is the idea that I'm not here to work. I'm here as a mission. I'm here to dedicate my life to God in whatever way I can do it. And I'm here to do the best I can every day in furtherance of that mission. I don't judge myself on whether the world has changed. I judge myself on whether I've brought hope to the people that I met that day.
Sherre, I want to ask you the same question because you're a religious leader, but in many ways for a different generation in a different context. Everybody betrays Moses in his life, in this book. Everybody betrays him, including God betrays him, and yet he still finds the inner rectitude to go forward, the inner strength to move forward. So I want to ask you, from your own experience as a religious leader, what keeps you moving forward? What keeps Moshe moving forward?
So beautiful question, Rabbi Feinstein. And I loved your answer, Rabbi Gellman, which is that, as Rick Warren says at Saddleback Church, you have to live a purpose-driven life. And what you're saying is that what drives you is the purpose, not the metrics of success, right? If you placed external metrics on it, who knows if we're successful? But that drive, because of your idealism and that sense of purpose, drives you. And I think a lot of rabbis feel that. I've always wondered about Moshe because he is beaten up, he is wrecked. He was like the prince of Egypt, and now he's like schlepping through the desert with a bunch of complainers. And I've always wondered about what kept him going. And I think there is, in some people, a desire to do good and to leave the world better, regardless of everything that collapses around them. And I put myself not in the Moses category, but in the category, and it's not optimism. Optimism is, I think everything's going to turn out great. I don't believe that. It's actually faith. It's like, I will get up and do this again because I have faith that the world can look different. And that what's kept me going when, especially in moments, whether it was in the pulpit or in an institutional life where I'm like, really, why am I doing this? I could be doing something with much less complaining. But what's kept me going is faith, is that the belief is that I believe that people can be elevated with faith to make the world better. And it sounds like a speech that Miss America gives, like, and all I want is world peace. Thank you so much. It's actually not that. It's that I believe that everybody has the capacity for faith. And if we can unleash that, everyone has true capacity to make impact and leave the world better. And I want to be an instrument or a vehicle for that. And so a lot of mornings when I don't want to wake up, I say to myself, is my job to serve me and my ideas, or to what I think, or is it to serve God and to help people find faith? And I think Moses probably said that a lot, because certainly the people weren't giving him hizuk or strength a lot of the time.
I really appreciate this from both of you. It's very, very powerful and very personal. One of the texts that really motivates me is the last page of the Guide for the Perplexed. So the Guide for the Perplexed, Moses Maimonides' magnum opus, is the most important philosophical book ever written in the Jewish tradition, and probably the most difficult. It's a very, very, very long, complex book. And the last page, he's struggling with a problem. And the problem is this problem. For Maimonides, the goal of life is to know God. And the symbol of that is Moses. Moses climbs the mountain and stands, as it were, panim el panim, face to face with God. And Maimonides can't figure out, if that's the case, and the purpose of life is to know God, and Moses is the man who knows God best, why does he come down the mountain? Why not stay up on the mountain? It's the same question here. It's a little bit different. It's not the question of why he becomes, how he defeats disillusionment. It's the question of why he accepts this mission altogether. Why not define your life as going up the mountain and knowing God? And, call it a day. Why come down to fetchy Jews? And as I read the book of Bamidbar, that's the question I keep asking myself. This was a man who climbed Mount Sinai and talked to God. Now he has to talk to people about what's for dinner. He has to talk to people who refuse to enter the promised land. He gives them the land. He says, here it is, take it. It's a land of milk and honey. They come back and say, nah, we don't want it. We want to go back to Egypt, right? And then his people rebel and his family rebels. And then, his sister dies. This is in Chukat. His sister dies. His sister's the only person he really loved in his whole life. She dies and he goes nuts, and the people fetch to him one more time, and he whacks the rock. I think it's so interesting, by the way, he didn't whack a person. He whacked the rock. That's because he's bigger man than most of us. And God says, okay, you whack the rock, you're not going in the land. Moses kept thinking to himself, I'm sure, I should have stayed up on the damn mountain. Who needs this? And Maimonides at the end says something very akin to what you both said. The fully realized human life is not to know God. It's to bring God into the world. It's to bring godly qualities to the people you encounter. It's mishpat and tzedek, to bring those qualities, and chesed, bring those qualities into the world. And that's Maimonides. It's the last paragraph of the last page of the last chapter in the most complicated philosophical book the Jewish people ever created. He says, come down the mountain and bring tzedek to the world. It's a beautiful permutation. It's his answer to the question of leadership. It's his answer.
I think, if I might say, that defines perfectly the difference between Eastern and Western religious traditions. If your only goal in your spiritual journey is personal enlightenment, which was true for the Buddha, for example, then you do stay on the mountain. He stayed under the Bodhi tree until he was basically gone, physically gone. And the Buddhist tradition actually had to modify the Buddha's own personal goal, which was nibbana, enlightenment, release in the Hindu sense, moksha, from the cycle of rebirth. They had to redo it to create a role for what they called the bodhisattva, which was an enlightened one who came back to help the people. Judaism doesn't have that tension. It doesn't have the tension of the solitary enlightened one. Moses came back down the mountain because he was a part of the people. Ultimately, Moses is a part of the people. Yes, he's God's prophet, but he is a part of the people. And that's the Jewish vision, that we find ourselves in a communal context. We can't find ourselves in solitary, what they call in the Middle Ages, unio mystica, the union of the mystic and God alone. That is not our vision. That is not our journey. And our journey is to be together. And I wanted to close my remarks this day with what I've been doing to keep myself going, which is to read the greatest poems in the Western canon, to try and find the ones I knew and read them again and try and gain inspiration from them. And last week, I read Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson again. And I just wanted to end this magnificent poem with his words. We are not now that strength which in old days moved heaven and earth. That which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find and not to yield. The guy could write.
Thank you. Sherre, you got a last word for us tonight for Shabbos?
I wanted to end on that because it's just so beautiful. But I will say that I spent a year meditating, and you said it so perfectly, Rabbi Gellman. When I was younger, I did spend a year. I spent a long time in silence. I traveled all over the East, and I kept hearing one refrain in the back of my head through every meditation. You're a Jew, go back to your people. Every single day. And I hear that every day is, you're a Jew, you're about the people, be with the people. So I'm into your comments.
Thank you. There's a beautiful Hasidus story, which is the same story. It's not nearly as profound as Alfred Lord Tennyson. It's about a Hasidic master who spends his lifetime in meditation, coming into the Hechalot, all the heavenly chambers. And one particular afternoon, he finds himself in the seventh chamber where God himself rests on a throne. And the Rebbe is approaching the throne. And it turns out that the Rebbe's daughter left the baby in the house and asked him to watch the baby. And just as the Rebbe is approaching the front of the throne to stand and see the face of God, the baby starts crying. The baby starts crying. And the Rebbe hears the baby crying up in heaven where he's meditating. His trance has taken him. And the story is that God turns to him and says, "No, no. What are you going to do? Where do your deepest loyalties lie? Where do you think worship of God lies? In your mystical journey to see the face of eternity, or in the baby who's crying in the other room, who's a different eternity for you?" And the Rebbe shrugs his shoulders and says, "I'm sorry, but I have to go and do what I need to do." And God says to the Rebbe, "Geh gesundheit, go and be strong." And he comes down and he cares for the child. It's the Moses tale told in a small shtetl. It's a beautiful story. I want to thank both of you for sharing a good morning of Torah. Thank you. A couple of quick commercials and announcements, of course, following our Torah study once again. Shabbos davening just in a few moments. 11:30 this morning, we commemorate Memorial Day by celebrating all the veterans, those that are with us and those that are not with us, all of those who have stood to defend America, defend Israel and Canada, and those who defend our land. So please come and join us at 11:30 for that very special celebration right here on Facebook Live. This week, Rabbi Gellman and I, Rabbi Hirsch, Rabbi Gellman and I have been recruited by our dear friend Rabbi Hirsch to present a session on the AJU. Would you tell us about that, Sherre?
I would love to. At aju.edu, B'yachad Together, which is a big old mouthful. I promise you that won't be the name forever. We are hosting Rabbi Gellman and Rabbi Feinstein in conversation at noon Pacific. As you might enjoy it here, you're going to love it because they're not going to have any constraints of the Shabbat or the Parsha. You're going to hear them really free speak and go at it. So I hope that you'll join us for that. And I hope you're invited to all our offerings at aju.edu, B'yachad Together. We'd love to have you for everything. So please come test it out at noon on Tuesday, Pacific time.
On the topic of writing modern midrash.
Writing modern midrash and how we read text. So I want to thank everyone and wish you all a very good Shabbos.
Shabbat